The night was cold. The streets were silent. And somewhere in the darkness of a medieval town, a woman began to dance. At first, nobody paid attention. People in the Middle Ages often believed strange behavior was caused by exhaustion, hunger, or sin. But this was different. The woman did not stop dancing after a few minutes, or after an hour. She danced through the entire night. By morning, her feet were bleeding. Still, she continued. Within days, others joined her. Men, women, even children flooded into the streets, moving wildly beneath the church bells of medieval Europe. Some screamed while dancing. Some cried for mercy. Others collapsed where they stood, only to rise again moments later and continue moving as if controlled by something unseen. Witnesses claimed their faces looked empty, almost possessed. Then people started dying. Some collapsed from heart attacks, others from exhaustion or strokes. Priests declared it punishment from God. Doctors blamed overheated blood. Ordinary villagers feared demons had entered the town itself. But nobody could explain the most terrifying detail of all. Why did hundreds of people begin dancing against their will? And why has nobody ever truly solved the mystery? Tonight, we travel deep into one of medieval history's strangest and most disturbing events. A case so bizarre that even modern historians struggle to explain it. Because in the summer of 1518, an entire city appeared to lose control of reality itself. And it all began with one woman dancing alone in the street. The dancing plague of Strasbourg. The summer of 1518 was brutally hot. The city of Strasbourg, located within the Holy Roman Empire, baked beneath weeks of oppressive heat. The narrow streets smelled of waste, livestock, and sickness. Food shortages had pushed many families towards starvation, and disease spread easily through overcrowded neighborhoods. Life during the medieval period was already filled with fear. Most people would never travel farther than a few miles from where they were born. Illness could appear without warning. Wars erupted constantly across Europe, and nearly every unexplained event was believed to carry a spiritual meaning. People feared God. They feared demons. And above all, they feared punishment. It was into this world that a woman known as Frau Troffer stepped into the street one July morning and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no celebration. According to historical accounts, she simply started moving uncontrollably outside her home. Witnesses described violent twisting motions and frantic steps beneath the blazing summer sun. At first, neighbors laughed. Perhaps she was drunk, perhaps mentally ill, perhaps simply seeking attention. But the laughter slowly disappeared because she did not stop. Hours passed, then an entire day, then another. Frau Troffer continued dancing through exhaustion, barely sleeping, barely eating. Her body should have collapsed completely. Yet somehow she kept moving, her feet striking the dirt streets again and again. Soon, her husband reportedly begged local authorities for help. Nobody knew what to do. And then something even stranger happened. Others began dancing too. At first, there were only a few, then dozens. Within a week, the streets of Strasbourg were crowded with people convulsing and spinning beneath the summer heat. Historical reports claim some dancers screamed in pain while continuing to move. Others begged bystanders to stop them. Some tore off their clothing in desperation. Many appeared completely disconnected from reality. The city descended into confusion. Imagine walking through medieval Strasbourg at that moment. Church bells echoing through narrow stone streets. Crowds gathering around exhausted dancers collapsing onto the ground. Priests shouting prayers over bodies trembling in the dust. Families dragging relatives indoors, terrified they might suddenly begin dancing themselves. Nobody understood what they were witnessing, and the fear spread faster than the plague itself. Today, historians still debate exactly how many people became infected by the strange phenomenon. Some accounts suggest dozens. Others claim hundreds joined the dancing mania over several weeks. But nearly all surviving records agree on one horrifying fact. People died. Some reportedly collapsed from strokes, others from heart failure or extreme exhaustion. Medieval medicine was powerless against something it could not explain. Yet the authorities made a decision that only made the situation worse. Instead of stopping the dancers, they encouraged them. At the time, local physicians believed the condition came from hot blood, a medical theory common during the medieval era. acoustic megalithinic, and the dancers needed to release the sickness from their bodies through continuous movements, so officials cleared parts of the city for dancing. They even hired musicians. Imagine the scene. Violins echoing across crowded streets while exhausted victims staggered beneath the heat. Drummers pounding rhythms as terrified citizens watched their neighbors dance themselves toward death. It sounds unbelievable now, but in 1518 this was considered legitimate medical treatment, and for a short time the madness only grew stronger. More dancers appeared every day. Some historians believe the psychological terror of witnessing the phenomenon may have contributed to its spread. In deeply religious medieval societies, fear itself could become contagious. If people believed supernatural punishment had arrived, panic could overwhelm entire communities. But there may have been something even darker hiding beneath the surface. To understand the mystery properly, we need to understand the medieval mind. The people of Strasbourg did not see the world the way modern people do. Today, strange illnesses are explained through science and psychology. But during the Middle Ages, the line between the natural and supernatural barely existed. A failed harvest might be interpreted as divine anger. A disease outbreak could be blamed on witches. An unexplained suffering was often viewed as evidence of spiritual corruption. Many citizens believed the dancers had been cursed by Saint Vitus, a Christian saint associated with neurological disorders and uncontrollable movement. According to local belief, offending the saint could cause victims to dance wildly until collapse. This fear already existed in medieval culture long before the outbreak began, which meant something terrifying could happen when panic entered the equation. If enough people believed they were vulnerable to a curse, could their own minds create the symptoms? Modern historians and psychologists have proposed several explanations for the dancing plague over the centuries. One theory suggests mass psychogenic illness, what many people informally call mass hysteria. In situations of extreme stress, fear, and religious pressure, groups of people can sometimes begin exhibiting shared physical symptoms without a direct physical cause. The human brain is powerful enough to influence the body in extraordinary ways, and medieval Europe was overflowing with trauma, famine, disease, religious fear, violence, constant uncertainty. Many citizens lived in a permanent state of anxiety. Some historians believe the dancing plague may have been a psychological breaking point, a collective explosion of fear and emotional suffering that manifested physically in the streets. But not everyone agrees. Another theory involves a poisonous fungus known as ergot, which can grow on damp rye grain. Consuming contaminated bread may cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, and strange behavior. Some researchers have suggested ergot poisoning might explain the bizarre dancing episodes. The theory became popular because ergot contains chemicals related to LSD-like compounds. But there is a problem. Ergot poisoning usually weakens coordination rather than sustaining intense physical activity for days at a time. Victims often suffer severe pain and paralysis. That makes the theory difficult to fully accept, and so the mystery remains unresolved. Which explanation is more frightening? That a mysterious illness spread through the city without explanation? Or that fear itself became powerful enough to destroy the human body? As the outbreak continued, Strasbourg authorities finally changed their approach. Religious leaders organized processions and prayers. Some dancers were transported to shrines associated with Saint Vitus. Others were given special shoes marked with holy symbols in hopes the curse would end. Gradually, the dancing began to fade. Weeks after the outbreak began, fewer people appeared in the streets. The city slowly returned to normal life. Markets reopened. Church services stabilized. Survivors attempted to move on. But nobody forgot what they had witnessed, because the dancing plague left behind a terrifying question that still echoes through history. How fragile is the human mind? Even now, centuries later, scientists still study the Strasbourg outbreak as one of history's strangest cases of collective behavior. And while modern explanations sound more rational than medieval curses, no single theory fully explains every detail. That uncertainty is what makes the story so disturbing. There was no monster hiding in the shadows, no invading army, no visible disease spreading from house to house, only ordinary people. Neighbors, families, children, people who suddenly lost control of themselves beneath the summer sun. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all, This was not the only time it happened. Across medieval Europe, smaller outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing appeared more than once. Entire groups sometimes moved in strange trances for hours or days. Priests documented the events with fear and confusion, unable to explain why seemingly normal people transformed so suddenly. History often feels distant, but the dancing plague reminds us something uncomfortable about human nature. Civilization is thinner than we imagine. Fear spreads, panic spreads, belief spreads, and sometimes entire societies can become trapped inside a story they no longer control. The streets of Strasbourg are quiet now. Tourists walk peacefully through areas where terrified medieval citizens once gathered around collapsing dancers. Most people passing through the city today have no idea that one of history's strangest mysteries unfolded there more than 500 years ago. But for those who witnessed it in 1518, the memory must have felt like the end of the world itself. The Children's Crusade. That vanished without a trace in the spring of 1212, thousands of children began marching across medieval Europe. Some carried wooden crosses, others wore rags and travelled barefoot across burning roads. Many were starving, most were exhausted, yet they continued walking toward a destination almost none of them had ever seen: Jerusalem. According to witnesses, they believed God himself had chosen them for a mission that fully armed knights had failed to accomplish. The adults had failed. The kings had failed. The crusades had failed. But the children believed they could succeed, and then they disappeared. Even now, more than 800 years later, historians still debate one disturbing question: what truly happened to the thousands of young people who marched into history and never returned? To understand the mystery, we first need to understand the world they lived in. Medieval Europe was a place shaped by suffering and faith. Most people lived short, brutal lives. Disease was everywhere. Famine struck often. Entire villages could disappear after a harsh winter or failed harvest. For ordinary people, religion was not simply part of life. It was life. The church shaped nearly every aspect of society. Priests explained disasters as divine punishment. Miracles were treated as real events. And Jerusalem, the holy city sacred to Christianity, held enormous emotional power across Europe. For generations, Christian armies had launched crusades to reclaim the city from Muslim control. Thousands of knights marched east believing they were fighting for God. Many never returned. By 1212, Europe was exhausted by war and disappointment. Yet amid this atmosphere of failure and desperation, strange rumors began spreading across France and Germany. Rumors about children chosen by God. According to medieval accounts, a young shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed he had received visions from Jesus Christ. Some stories say a mysterious pilgrim handed him a letter for the King of France. Others claim Stephen performed miracles and gathered enormous crowds wherever he travelled. Whether the stories were true hardly mattered. People wanted to believe, and slowly thousands began listening. Witnesses described massive gatherings surrounding the young preacher as he spoke about faith, innocence, and divine destiny. He reportedly claimed that children, pure and untouched by greed, could succeed where violent armies had failed. The idea spread with astonishing speed. Soon, similar reports emerged from Germany. Another boy, often identified as Nicholas of Cologne, began leading enormous groups southward toward the Mediterranean Sea. And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling. Because despite the popular name Children's Crusade, historians believe many participants were not actually small children. Medieval records often use words that could also refer to poor wanderers, servants, teenagers, labourers, or displaced peasants. But regardless of their exact ages, what matters is this: thousands of vulnerable people left their homes believing they were part of a holy mission. Some travelled hundreds of miles by foot. Imagine the roads of medieval Europe filled with crowds moving south beneath the summer heat. Thin figures carrying crude crosses. Hungry travellers sleeping in fields and abandoned barns. Parents desperately searching for missing sons and daughters among enormous wandering groups. No organised army protected them. No supply system supported them. Most had almost nothing. Yet the movement continued growing. Some witnesses describe participants singing hymns while marching through towns. Others reported starvation, illness, and chaos spreading through the crowds. And still they believed. According to legend, many expected the Mediterranean Sea itself to part before them, allowing safe passage to Jerusalem, just as Moses crossed the Red Sea in the Bible. But reality was far crueler. When the travelers finally reached coastal cities like Marseille in southern France, the sea did not open. Nothing happened. Imagine their disappointment. Weeks or months of walking, exhaustion, hunger, faith stretched to its limits, and only endless water waiting before them. This is where the mystery becomes darker. Some medieval accounts claim merchants offered to transport the pilgrims across the sea for free. Ships were prepared, crowds boarded hopefully, believing they were finally reaching the Holy Land. But according to later stories, several ships vanished during storms near the Mediterranean islands. Others allegedly reached North Africa, where the passengers were sold into slavery. If true, the fate of many participants was horrific. Young pilgrims who believed they were serving God may instead have been trafficked into foreign markets far from home. But historians face a major problem when studying the Children's Crusade. The records are confusing, contradictory, and often written decades after the events themselves. Some chroniclers exaggerated details dramatically, others mixed legends with facts. Medieval writers frequently transformed real events into moral stories meant to teach religious lessons rather than preserve accurate history. This leaves modern historians struggling to separate truth from myth. Did tens of thousands truly march across Europe? Were most participants children? Did slave traders exploit the movement? Or did later storytellers slowly reshape the event into something larger and more tragic over time? Nobody knows for certain. Yet beneath the uncertainty lies something deeply revealing about medieval society. The Children's Crusade may not have been a traditional crusade at all. Some scholars believe it was closer to a massive social movement created by poverty, desperation, and religious obsession. Europe in the early 1200s was filled with displaced people suffering from economic hardship. Many ordinary citizens lived without stability or opportunity, and when charismatic figures promised meaning, salvation, or divine purpose, people followed, especially the young. The medieval world offered few choices for poor children and teenagers. Many worked brutal jobs from an early age. Some became servants, others wandered after losing families to disease or famine. A movement promising spiritual importance could have felt irresistible. But there may be another reason the story endured so powerfully across history. Because the idea itself is haunting. Thousands of innocent people walking toward a miracle that never came. A generation driven by faith into uncertainty. A mass movement fueled not by armies or kings, but by belief alone. Even modern audiences feel disturbed by the story because it touches something universal about human nature. Hope can inspire extraordinary courage, but hope can also make people vulnerable, especially when powerful ideas spread faster than reality. As the years passed, the Children's Crusade transformed into legend. Medieval writers described miraculous visions, angels, betrayals, and disasters. The story became part warning, part tragedy, part religious myth. And perhaps that is why the mystery still survives. Not because every detail is historically proven, but because the emotional truth feels real. Imagine parents standing beside dusty roads watching crowds disappear into the distance, unsure if they would ever see their children again. Imagine starving travelers praying for the sea to open before them. Imagine realizing too late that faith alone could not protect them from the dangers of the world. The Middle Ages were filled with violence and war. Yet some of history's darkest tragedies emerged not from armies, but from belief. And the Children's Crusade reveals how powerful collective belief can become when mixed with suffering and desperation. Even today, historians continue debating what actually occurred in 1212. Some argue the event has been heavily romanticized. Others believe the core tragedy was very real. But nearly everyone agrees on one thing. Something extraordinary happened. Large groups of vulnerable people truly crossed medieval Europe under religious inspiration, and many likely vanished into hunger, disease, exploitation, or death along the way. Their final fate remains uncertain. No complete records exist. No definitive answers survive. Only fragments remain scattered across medieval chronicles written by frightened and confused witnesses trying to explain events they barely understood themselves. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the mystery so unsettling. History remembers kings, battles, empires, but somewhere along the roads of medieval Europe, thousands of ordinary young people disappeared into silence. No graves mark most of their journeys. No monuments fully explain their fate. Only stories survive. Stories about children marching toward Jerusalem beneath the burning sun, believing heaven itself was guiding their steps. And somewhere between history and legend, the truth was lost forever. The Green Children of Woolpit. One summer afternoon in medieval England, villagers harvesting crops near a deep wolf pit heard strange cries rising from the earth. At first they thought an animal had become trapped underground, but when they moved closer, they saw something impossible. Two children were crouched inside the pit, a boy and a girl. They looked human, but something about them was deeply wrong. Their skin was completely green, not painted, not stained by dirt. Green. The terrified villagers of Woolpit had never seen anything like it before. The children wore strange clothing made from unfamiliar fabric. They spoke a language nobody recognized, and according to witnesses, they refused to eat normal food. Then the mystery became even stranger, because the children claimed they came from another world hidden beneath the earth. For centuries, historians have struggled to explain what really happened in the small English village of Woolpit during the 12th century. Some believe the children were victims of illness or abandonment. Others think the story slowly transformed into folklore over time. But even today, the mystery remains one of medieval Europe's most haunting legends. And perhaps the strangest part of all, the story may contain more truth than people realize. To understand why the villagers were so disturbed, we need to understand medieval England itself. Life in rural villages during the 1100s was isolated and harsh. Most ordinary people rarely encountered foreigners. Travel was dangerous, roads were poor, and entire communities could exist for generations with little contact from the outside world. Anything unfamiliar immediately attracted fear and suspicion, especially children appearing from nowhere. The village of Woolpit, located in Suffolk, England, took its name from large pits dug to trap wolves. These deep holes were dangerous places, especially for wandering travellers or animals. And according to the medieval chroniclers Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, it was near one of these pits that the strange children were discovered. Witnesses described them as terrified and confused. The villagers attempted to speak with them, but the children answered in completely unknown words. Nobody could identify their language or homeland. Worse still, they refused almost every type of food offered to them. Bread, meat, fruit, nothing. The children appeared close to starvation. Then someone brought freshly harvested beans. Suddenly the children rushed toward them desperately and began eating. For days, beans were reportedly the only food they would accept. It sounds like a small detail, but in medieval storytelling, strange details mattered deeply. The image of mysterious green children surviving only on beans made the entire event feel unnatural to witnesses trying to understand what they were seeing. Eventually, the children were taken into the care of a local landowner named Sir Richard de Caunay. Slowly, they began adapting to village life, and over time, something even stranger happened. The green color of their skin reportedly began to fade. As the children ate more normal food and adjusted to their new environment, their appearance gradually became more human. The boy, however, became ill and later died. Only the girl survived into adulthood. And according to later accounts, once she learned English, she revealed an extraordinary story about where they came from. The children claimed they originated from a mysterious land called St. Martin's Land, a place where everything was green, a place where sunlight barely existed, a place where eternal twilight covered the landscape. According to the girl, the siblings had been tending cattle when they discovered a cave. Following the sound of distant bells, they wandered through darkness until suddenly emerging into the unfamiliar world near Woolpit. To medieval listeners, the story sounded impossible, but also strangely believable, because during the Middle Ages, people genuinely believed hidden worlds might exist beneath the earth. Religious teachings, folklore, and superstition blended together constantly. Tales of underground kingdoms, supernatural beings, and mysterious realms were common across Europe. The Green Children seemed to fit perfectly into that worldview. Yet centuries later, modern historians began searching for rational explanations, and some of them are surprisingly convincing. One popular theory suggests the children may have been Flemish immigrants. During the medieval period, many Flemish settlers lived in parts of eastern England. Political violence and conflict often displaced entire communities. If the children had become separated from their families, their unfamiliar language and clothing could have confused local villagers. Their green skin may also have had a medical explanation. Some historians believe the children suffered from hyperchromic anemia, a condition caused by severe malnutrition that can sometimes give skin a pale greenish tint. If starving foreign children suddenly appeared in an isolated English village, frightened locals might easily interpret them as supernatural, especially in a world already shaped by fear and religious imagination. But there are still problems with the theory. Why did the children describe such a strange underground world? Why did medieval chroniclers preserve the story so carefully? And why did the details remain remarkably consistent across multiple accounts? The answer may reveal something important about the medieval mind. People during the Middle Ages did not separate reality and symbolism the way modern societies do. Stories often carried layers of meaning at once. The Green Children may have been real abandoned migrants whose story gradually transformed into folklore through retelling. Over time, ordinary confusion became mystery, mystery became legend, and legend became immortal. Yet there is another reason this story still fascinates people today, because it touches something ancient and uncomfortable inside the human imagination: the fear of outsiders. Imagine living in an isolated medieval village where almost everyone looked, dressed, and spoke the same way. Then suddenly encountering children who seemed completely alien, different skin, different language, different behavior. They would have felt like creatures from another world. And in many ways, that is exactly how medieval people described them. The story also reveals how deeply people longed to believe hidden worlds existed beyond ordinary life. Medieval Europe was filled with invisible boundaries between the known and unknown. Forests were feared, caves were feared. Wilderness itself often symbolized danger and mystery. Most people understood only a tiny part of the world around them, and so strange discoveries became gateways into imagination. Even today, the Green Children of Woolpit continue inspiring theories far beyond medieval history. Some modern writers claim the story involves extraterrestrials. Others suggest parallel dimensions or hollow earth legends, but historians generally approach such theories cautiously. There is no evidence the children were supernatural beings. More likely, the original event was tragic and human. Two lost children, appearing in an isolated village during a period of hardship and confusion. Yet perhaps the supernatural explanation survived because it felt emotionally true to the people hearing the story. The children arrived from darkness. They spoke unknown words. They belonged nowhere. And for medieval audiences, that mystery represented something larger than simple reality. It represented the terrifying possibility that unknown worlds might exist just beyond human understanding. As years passed, the surviving girl reportedly adapted fully into English society. Some accounts claim she eventually married and lived an ordinary life, which raises another unsettling thought. What if the most mysterious people in history were never truly mysterious at all? What if many legends began with frightened witnesses trying to explain something unfamiliar? History is filled with moments where ordinary events transformed into myths because people lacked the tools to understand what they had seen. And yet, even when rational explanations exist, the emotional power of the story remains. That is why the Green Children still haunt historians centuries later, because beneath the strange details lies something deeply human. Two frightened children appearing from nowhere, a village struggling to understand them, and a society so isolated that difference itself became supernatural. The fields around Woolpit are quiet now. The wolf pits are gone. But somewhere beneath the layers of myth and history, the memory survives. A boy and a girl emerging from darkness beneath the medieval sun, speaking words nobody could understand. And for one brief moment in history, an entire village believed visitors from another world had arrived among them. The village that disappeared during the Black Death. In the winter of 1348, the bells of a small English village suddenly stopped ringing. At first, nobody outside the settlement noticed. Medieval Europe was filled with tiny villages scattered across forests, hills, and muddy fields. Many were isolated for weeks during harsh winters. Silence was not unusual. But when travelers eventually arrived months later, they found something deeply disturbing. The village was empty. Homes still stood untouched. Cooking pots remained near cold fireplaces. Tools lay abandoned in workshops. Animals wandered freely through the streets. But the people were gone. Not a single villager remained alive. And according to later accounts, some bodies were still lying where they had fallen. Today, historians believe hundreds of similar villages disappeared during the horrors of the Black Death. Yet certain abandoned settlements became surrounded by fear and mystery so powerful that locals avoided them for generations. Because when entire communities vanish almost overnight, the human imagination begins searching for explanations. And during the Middle Ages, those explanations were often terrifying. To understand why abandoned villages became so feared, we first need to understand the sheer horror of the Black Death itself. Few events in human history were as catastrophic. Beginning in the 1340s, plague swept across Europe with terrifying speed. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population may have died within only a few years. Entire cities changed forever. Mass graves filled faster than priests could bless them. Parents buried children. Children buried parents, and many had nobody left to bury them at all. The disease arrived silently. A ship enters harbour. A merchant begins coughing. A rat disappears beneath the floorboards. Then suddenly entire neighbourhoods are dying. Victims often develop swollen black boils called buboes beneath their arms and around the neck. Fever followed. Vomiting followed. Agonising pain spread through the body. In many cases, death arrived within days. Medieval medicine was helpless. Doctors burned herbs. Priests organised prayers. Some citizens whipped themselves publicly, hoping to earn God's forgiveness. Nothing stopped the plague. Fear consumed Europe completely. People abandoned family members to avoid infection. Some fled into forests or mountains. Others locked themselves inside homes, praying the sickness would pass them by. And in this atmosphere of terror, abandoned villages became symbols of pure nightmare. One of the most famous examples was the English village of Eyam. Today, Eyam is remembered for extraordinary courage during a later plague outbreak in the 1600s. But many earlier medieval villages were not remembered so kindly. Some settlements simply vanished from maps entirely. Take the lost village of Warren Percy in England, or the dozens of abandoned settlements scattered across Europe, where stone foundations remain hidden beneath fields and forests. Not every village disappeared solely because of plague. War, famine, economic collapse, and climate shifts also destroyed communities. But during the Black Death, the speed of death created something psychologically devastating. People began associating entire locations with evil itself. Imagine approaching a medieval village after hearing rumors of sickness. No smoke rising from chimneys, no voices, only silence. The roads empty, doors hanging open, and somewhere inside dark wooden homes, the dead waiting untouched. For medieval travellers, such places felt cursed, and perhaps no place inspired more fear than the tiny settlement of Gainsthorpe in England. According to local legends, the village was abandoned after a devastating plague outbreak. Later, visitors reportedly heard strange sounds echoing through the ruins at night. Some claimed ghostly figures moved between collapsed homes after sunset. Stories spread quickly. Locals whispered that the dead still walked there. Others believed the village had been punished by God for hidden sins. Whether true or not, the emotional impact was real. People avoided abandoned plague villages for generations. Even healthy survivors feared entering them, because the Black Death shattered society's understanding of safety itself. Before the plague, medieval people already lived with hardship and disease, but nothing prepared them for death on such an unimaginable scale. Entire monasteries disappeared. Farms failed because nobody remained alive to work them. In some regions, bodies reportedly piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. The normal rules of life collapsed. And once fear enters a society at that level, mysteries begin multiplying rapidly. Some medieval citizens believed the plague was divine punishment. Others blamed poisoned wells. Jewish communities across Europe were falsely accused of causing the disaster, leading to horrific massacres driven by panic and conspiracy. When people cannot explain catastrophe, they often create enemies. and during the Black Death, fear itself became almost as deadly as the disease. But perhaps the most disturbing part of abandoned villages was what they represented psychologically. They proved entire communities could disappear, not through war, not through invasion, but through something invisible. A single infected flea biting a rat could begin a chain of death powerful enough to erase generations of families from existence. That reality changed Europe forever. Modern historians now understand the plague was caused primarily by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, often spread through fleas carried by rats. But medieval people had no understanding of bacteria or infection. To them, plague felt supernatural, and abandoned villages became physical reminders of humanity's helplessness. Even today, archaeologists continue uncovering lost settlements buried beneath forests and farmland across Europe. Beneath the soil lie traces of ordinary lives suddenly interrupted. Shoes beside doorways, broken dishes, children's toys, objects left behind by people who likely believed they would return home. Many never did. One particularly haunting discovery emerged from plague pits found beneath European cities. Archaeologists uncovered mass graves where bodies had been buried rapidly during outbreaks. Some victims still showed signs of hurried burial, suggesting fear overwhelmed normal funeral rituals. Think about what that means. For medieval Christians, proper burial was deeply important spiritually. Yet the plague became so terrifying that even sacred traditions began collapsing under pressure. Fear overpowered everything. And perhaps that is why the mystery of abandoned villages still disturbs people centuries later, because they reveal how fragile civilization truly is. A village can exist for hundreds of years. Families marry there, children grow old there, generations build homes stone by stone. Then suddenly, within weeks, silence. No dramatic final battle, no warning, only empty streets beneath grey skies. The Middle Ages often appear distant to modern audiences, but the emotional reality of plague remains strangely familiar. Panic, isolation, rumours, fear spreading faster than facts. Human behaviour changes quickly during catastrophe, and during the Black Death, ordinary people faced a level of terror almost impossible to imagine today. Some villages tried sealing themselves off completely. Others expelled outsiders violently. Some communities prayed constantly. Others surrendered to despair. But no matter how people responded, one truth remained unavoidable. Nobody knew who would die next. Imagine going to sleep each night knowing a fever could appear by morning. Imagine hearing carts rolling through dark streets collecting bodies. Imagine entire families disappearing within days. That constant fear reshaped Europe psychologically, economically, and spiritually. And the abandoned villages left behind became monuments to that fear. Even now, some ruined settlements across Europe carry local ghost stories linked to plague deaths centuries ago. Travelers report strange feelings among empty foundations reclaimed by nature. Whether supernatural or not, such places remind people how suddenly ordinary life can vanish. Grass now grows over forgotten roads. Forests cover collapsed homes. Birds nest where families once gathered around fires. But beneath the silence, traces remain. The memory of a world where entire villages disappeared into death so completely that later generations could barely believe the stories were real. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this. For many victims of the Black Death, there was no mystery at all. Only ordinary life one week and darkness the next. The medieval book nobody can read, locked inside a climate-controlled vault at Yale University, sits one of the most mysterious books ever created. Its pages are filled with strange plants that do not exist. Unfamiliar star charts spiral across faded parchment. Naked human figures float through impossible green pools connected by bizarre tubes and symbols. And every single page is covered in writing that nobody on Earth has successfully decoded. For more than 600 years, the manuscript has resisted historians, cryptographers, linguists, codebreakers, and even modern artificial intelligence. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows what language it uses. And no one knows whether the book contains hidden knowledge or one of history's greatest hoaxes. This is the mystery of the Voynich manuscript, a medieval book so strange that even today, experts still argue whether it hides a genuine secret or was designed purely to confuse the world forever. The manuscript itself is beautiful in an unsettling way. Its pages appear ancient and fragile, filled with flowing handwritten text composed of completely unknown symbols. At first glance, the writing almost looks familiar, as though it belongs to a forgotten European language. But closer inspection reveals something deeply wrong. The alphabet does not match any known writing system. Not Latin, not Greek, not Arabic, nothing. The text flows with patterns resembling real language. Certain symbols repeat in ways that suggest grammar and structure. Some words appear frequently while others are rare, much like natural human communication, and yet nobody can understand a single sentence. The mystery becomes even stranger when examining the illustrations. Many pages contain drawings of plants unlike anything found in nature. Some resemble real herbs partially, but the details twist into impossible forms. Roots connect incorrectly. Leaves belong to no known species. It is as if someone attempted to recreate plants from memory after seeing them in a dream. Other sections show astronomical diagrams featuring stars, moons, and mysterious circular designs. One series of pages unfolds outward into large diagrams filled with castles, strange symbols, and unknown systems. Then come the images many historians find most disturbing. Rows of naked women bathing inside green liquid. Bodies emerging from tubes. Human figures floating through interconnected pools like parts of some forgotten machine. The purpose of these illustrations remains completely unclear. Medicine? Alchemy? Astronomy? Religion? Nobody knows. Even the age of the manuscript remained uncertain for centuries until modern testing revealed something remarkable. The parchment dates back to the early 1400s. That discovery shocked researchers, because it proved the manuscript was genuinely medieval, not a modern fake. Somebody in the Middle Ages truly created this impossible book, and they either possessed knowledge lost to history or created one of the most elaborate deceptions ever attempted. The manuscript takes its modern name from Wilfrid Voynich, a rare book dealer who purchased it in 1912. But the book's earlier history remains fragmented and mysterious. Over the centuries, it passed through the hands of scholars, collectors, and emperors. Some believed it contained secret scientific knowledge. Others thought it was magical or dangerous. One rumor even claimed the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II purchased the manuscript believing it be written by the famous philosopher Roger Bacon. That claim was probably false, but it reveals how strange the book appeared even to people living hundreds of years closer to its creation. The deeper researchers investigate the manuscript, the more unsettling the mystery becomes, because many aspects suggest the text should be meaningful. Statistical analysis shows the writing behaves similarly to genuine language. Patterns repeat naturally. Word lengths vary realistically. Certain symbols appear more often at the beginnings or endings of lines. Random nonsense should not behave this way, and yet every decoding attempt fails. During World War II, elite code breakers who worked on military encryption reportedly studied the manuscript without success. Modern computers have analyzed it extensively. Linguists from around the world continue searching for hidden structure. Still nothing. Imagine the frustration: a real medieval manuscript. Pages filled with coherent-looking writing, but completely unreadable. It feels almost impossible, which is exactly why so many theories exist. Some historians believe the manuscript contains an encrypted language designed to hide secret knowledge. Medieval Europe was filled with alchemists, astrologers, and scholars who sometimes concealed their work to avoid persecution. Perhaps the author invented a cipher nobody has fully cracked. Others believe the manuscript may represent a forgotten or constructed language. Throughout history, some scholars attempted to create entirely new systems of writing, but there are problems with both theories. Creating such a massive text in code during the 1400s would have required enormous effort. Every page is densely written. The illustrations are highly detailed. If the book was encrypted, why include strange images no one could understand? Then comes the theory many researchers find most disturbing. What if the manuscript means absolutely nothing at all? Some historians argue the Voynich manuscript may be a sophisticated medieval hoax created to impress wealthy buyers. According to this idea, the unknown symbols only imitate language without carrying actual meaning. In other words, the book may have been designed specifically to appear mysterious. At first, that explanation sounds disappointing, but think about what it would mean. A medieval person creating hundreds of pages of fake writing so convincing that modern computers still struggle to prove it meaningless. If true, the hoax itself becomes extraordinary. And perhaps that is why the manuscript continues haunting historians. Because every explanation creates another mystery. If it is real, nobody can read it. If it is fake, nobody understands how someone created such convincing complexity centuries ago. The uncertainty feels endless, yet the emotional power of the manuscript goes beyond simple mystery. The book feels forbidden. Even modern viewers looking at its pages often describe an uneasy sensation. The unfamiliar symbols trigger something psychological inside the human mind. We instinctively search for meaning in written language, but the Voynich manuscript refuses understanding completely. It confronts people with the terrifying possibility that knowledge can exist beyond interpretation. Throughout the medieval world, books themselves already carried enormous power. Most ordinary people could not read. Libraries were rare. Written text often belonged to monasteries, nobles, or wealthy scholars. Books represented authority, truth, knowledge, and occasionally danger. Some medieval manuscripts genuinely did contain hidden medical formulas, occult theories, or alchemical experiments. Others mix science, religion, and superstition together in ways modern audiences would barely recognize. The Voynich manuscript emerged from that world, a world where astronomy blended with astrology, where medicine mixed with magic, where scholars searched for hidden truths about the universe using methods that now seem bizarre. Perhaps the manuscript was created by someone trying to preserve secret ideas, or perhaps by someone descending slowly into obsession. One especially haunting theory suggests the author may have genuinely believed the text made sense, even if nobody else could understand it. History contains many examples of individuals inventing private languages or symbolic systems driven by intense religious or psychological experiences. If so, the manuscript might represent the isolated thoughts of a single medieval mind trying desperately to communicate something impossible. And that possibility changes the mystery entirely, because suddenly the manuscript stops feeling like a puzzle and starts feeling human. A lonely voice reaching across 6 centuries, still unable to make itself understood. Even today, researchers continue publishing new theories every year. Some claim the text hides Hebrew patterns. Others connect it to extinct Asian languages. Artificial intelligence programs have attempted machine analysis with limited success. Nothing fully solves the mystery, and perhaps nothing ever will. The Voynich manuscript survives because it occupies a strange space between history and imagination. Unlike mythical artifacts, the book is real. You can see it, study it, turn its pages carefully beneath controlled light, and still remain completely lost. In an age where almost every question seems searchable, the manuscript feels deeply unsettling. A reminder that some mysteries endure, not because people stop trying, but because the answers may truly be beyond reach. Somewhere in the early 1400s, under candlelight in medieval Europe, someone sat patiently filling page after page with symbols nobody alive today can understand. They knew what the words meant. They understood the drawings. They had a purpose. Then they died, and whatever secret existed inside the manuscript may have died with them forever. The silent deaths inside medieval monasteries. Deep within the stone walls of medieval monasteries, strange deaths sometimes occurred behind locked doors. Monks would go to sleep normally and never wake up again. No wounds, no signs of struggle, no clear illness, just bodies discovered in cold, candlelit chambers while church bells echoed through empty halls. In some monasteries, the deaths happened only once. In others, they returned again and again. Soon whispers began spreading through medieval Europe. Something evil was moving through the monasteries. Some blamed demons, others blamed poison. A few feared the monks themselves were hiding terrible secrets. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility is this. Many of the deaths may have been caused not by supernatural forces, but by the terrifying conditions of medieval religious life itself. To understand the mystery, we first need to enter the world of a medieval monastery. At first glance, monasteries appeared peaceful. Far removed from war, disease, and political violence, they stood as isolated centers of prayer and learning. Thick stone walls separated monks from ordinary society. Candles flickered beside handwritten manuscripts. Bells marked the passing hours with strict precision. To outsiders, monasteries often seemed sacred, safe. But behind the silence existed a life of extraordinary hardship. Many monks slept only a few hours each night. Some woke before dawn daily for prayer. Long fasting periods weakened the body. Cold stone buildings offered little protection during winter. Disease spread easily through cramped quarters. And perhaps most importantly, many monks lived under constant psychological pressure. The medieval church taught terrifying visions of sin, hell, and divine judgment. Religious devotion was not gentle or comforting in the modern sense. It could be overwhelming, obsessive, even frightening. Some monks spent years believing invisible spiritual warfare surrounded them constantly. Demons were considered real. Temptation was considered dangerous. Even private thoughts could become sources of guilt and terror. Inside isolated monasteries, these fears sometimes intensified dramatically. One famous example comes from accounts surrounding the monastery of Cluny in medieval France. Although many stories were exaggerated over time, chroniclers described monks suffering terrifying nighttime experiences. Some claimed shadowy figures appeared beside beds. Others reported hearing voices or screams echoing through dark hallways. A few monks allegedly died suddenly after describing horrifying visions. To medieval observers, the explanations seemed obvious. Evil forces had entered the monastery, but modern historians and psychologists see something more complex. Sleep paralysis, stress-induced hallucinations, illness, exhaustion, and psychological trauma may explain many of these terrifying experiences. Yet that explanation almost makes the stories more disturbing, because it means the human mind itself may have created the horrors. Imagine living inside a cold medieval monastery for decades, minimal sleep, constant fasting, fear of eternal damnation, isolation from the outside world, no modern understanding of mental health or neurological conditions. Under such conditions, strange experiences become far easier to understand, especially at night. Many monasteries were illuminated only by candles after sunset. Long stone corridors vanished into darkness. Wind howled through narrow windows. Every sound echoed. And in the deeply religious society already expecting supernatural attack, ordinary psychological experiences could quickly transform into terrifying certainty. One particularly disturbing medieval belief involved demonic visitation during sleep. Across Europe, people described waking in the night unable to move while sensing an evil presence pressing against their chest. Today we recognize this as a classic symptom of sleep paralysis. But medieval people had no neurological explanation. To them, it felt absolutely real. Some believed demons physically attack victims during the night. Others thought witches or evil spirits entered rooms invisibly. Inside monasteries, where religious fear was already heightened, such experiences could spread panic rapidly. And sometimes panic itself became deadly. There are records of monks collapsing from extreme fear after witnessing what they believed were supernatural events. In some cases, sudden deaths may have resulted from heart conditions, illness, or stress responses intensified by terror. But because medieval medicine lacked scientific understanding, mysterious deaths quickly gained supernatural explanations. The stories grew darker over time. One monastery chronicler described a monk who reportedly screamed during the night about seeing burning figures beside his bed before dying hours later. Another account tells of monks refusing to sleep alone after hearing unexplained footsteps through monastery halls. And while some stories were certainly exaggerated, the emotional fear behind them was very real. Because medieval monasteries existed in a strange psychological environment, there were places devoted to holiness, but also places obsessed with evil. Monks spent enormous amounts of time studying sin, temptation, suffering, death, and judgment. Religious art often depicted demons dragging souls into hellfire. Sermons warned constantly about invisible spiritual danger. The line between faith and fear became dangerously thin. And sometimes that fear consumed people completely, yet there may have been even darker realities hiding beneath the legends. Some historians believe certain mysterious monastery deaths may have resulted from poisoning or disease outbreaks concealed by religious authorities. Medieval monasteries often stored wine, herbs, and medicines that could become contaminated. Mold growing within damp stone buildings may also have contributed to hallucinations or illness. Poor ventilation, smoke inhalation from candles, and unsanitary conditions created dangerous environments without anyone fully realizing it. Then there was the issue of silence itself. Monasteries were isolated. What happened inside their walls often stayed there, and in rare cases, darker human behavior may have been hidden beneath religious authority. Political rivalries, corruption, or personal conflicts occasionally existed even within religious communities. Some suspicious deaths may never have been investigated properly because medieval institutions lacked modern forensic methods. A body discovered without visible injury could easily become God's will rather than a criminal mystery. But regardless of the exact causes, the stories surrounding monastery deaths spread across Europe because they reflected something deeply unsettling about the medieval world. Places considered closest to God still contained fear, still contained death, still contained mystery. And perhaps that realization disturbed people more than anything else. Even sacred walls could not protect human beings from the unknown. As centuries passed, abandoned monasteries became surrounded by ghost stories and local legends. Villages claimed strange chanting echoed through ruined halls at night. Some believed restless monks still wandered ancient corridors, unable to find peace. Today, many ruined monasteries across Europe remain eerily silent places. Massive stone arches stand empty beneath grey skies. Grass grows between cracked floors where monks once prayed for salvation. Wind moves through roofless chapels that once echoed with candlelit hymns. And standing inside those ruins, it becomes easier to understand why fear thrived there. Isolation changes people. Silence changes people, especially when mixed with exhaustion, guilt, and belief. Modern audiences often imagine medieval monasteries as peaceful retreats filled with wisdom and calm reflection. In reality, many were emotionally intense environments shaped by strict discipline and constant awareness of death. Remember, medieval life expectancy was short, disease was common, and religion focused heavily on preparing the soul for judgment after death. Monks thought about mortality constantly. Some even slept beside skulls as reminders of life's fragility. Under such conditions, mysterious deaths gained enormous emotional power, because they seemed to confirm something terrifying, that unseen forces might truly exist just beyond human understanding. Yet perhaps the real mystery is not supernatural at all. Perhaps the mystery is how much fear the human mind can create when trapped in darkness and uncertainty. Inside the monasteries of medieval Europe, people searched desperately for divine truth. But sometimes, surrounded by silence and candlelight, they instead found something far more frightening: themselves. And somewhere in the cold stone corridors of forgotten monasteries, beneath centuries of rumor and legend, the echoes of those fears still remain. The cursed tomb of the Iron King. In the year 814, the most powerful ruler in Europe was buried beneath a cathedral floor. For decades, he had dominated the continent. Kings obeyed him, armies feared him, and the medieval world viewed him almost as a second Roman emperor. His name was Charlemagne. But according to later legends, something terrifying happened when his tomb was opened centuries after his death. Inside the dark burial chamber, witnesses claimed they found the emperor still sitting upright on a throne. His crown rested upon his skull. A Bible lay open on his lap, and the dead king appeared to be staring directly at them from the shadows. Then the curse began. At least, that is what medieval rumors claimed. Over the centuries, strange stories spread around Charlemagne's tomb. Emperors who disturbed it supposedly suffered disaster. Some died unexpectedly. Others lost power or faced catastrophe soon afterward. Soon people began whispering that the tomb itself carried a curse, and like many medieval mysteries, the line between truth and legend slowly disappeared. To understand why the stories became so powerful, we first need to understand who Charlemagne really was. During the early Middle Ages, Europe was fractured and violent. The Roman Empire in the West had collapsed centuries earlier. Kingdoms fought constantly for territory. Invasions swept across the continent. Stability barely existed. Then Charlemagne rose to power. Through conquest, diplomacy, and ruthless military campaigns, he built an empire stretching across much of Western Europe. In the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans in Rome itself. the symbolism was enormous. To many people, it felt as though ancient Rome had returned. Charlemagne became more than a king. He became a near mythical figure, even during his own lifetime. Medieval writers described him as wise, powerful, and chosen by God. But after his death in 814, the empire slowly weakened, and as centuries passed, stories surrounding the emperor became darker and stranger. He was buried in the city of Aachen, inside a magnificent chapel he had personally commissioned. The structure still stands today, massive and solemn beneath the German sky. According to medieval accounts, Charlemagne was not buried lying down like most rulers. Instead, he was allegedly placed seated upon a marble throne wearing royal garments and a crown. Whether entirely true or partially symbolic, the image deeply affected medieval imagination. A dead emperor sitting eternally in silence beneath the cathedral, watching, waiting. Then, nearly 2 centuries later, the tomb was reportedly opened by Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. And this is where the mystery truly begins. Medieval chroniclers described Otto descending into the burial chamber and discovering Charlemagne's body remarkably preserved. Some accounts claim the corpse remained seated upright exactly as it had been placed centuries earlier. The emperor's flesh had decayed, but the skeleton still wore royal clothing and a golden crown. One story even claims Otto removed a necklace from the corpse as a sacred relic. Almost immediately, rumors spread that disturbing the tomb brought misfortune. Otto III died young only a few years later. For medieval observers, the connection felt obvious. The dead emperor had not wanted to be disturbed, and over time, each new opening of the tomb added more legends to the curse. Another emperor allegedly opened the tomb centuries later and suffered political disaster afterward. Some chroniclers claim strange events occurred whenever Charlemagne's remains were moved or examined. Whether coincidence or not, the patterns strengthened the mythology. The tomb became feared, but perhaps the most unsettling detail of all is that parts of the story may actually be true. Historical records confirm Charlemagne's tomb was indeed opened multiple times during the Middle Ages. Medieval rulers viewed him as a symbol of legitimacy and imperial authority. Possessing relics connected to Charlemagne carried enormous political value, and medieval Europe treated relics very seriously. Bones of saints, fragments of clothing, objects associated with holy or powerful figures. These items were believed to carry spiritual significance. In some cases, rulers genuinely believed touching such relics connected them to divine favor, but disturbing graves always carried emotional danger too, especially the grave of a man already transformed into legend. Imagine descending into a dark medieval tomb illuminated only by torchlight, dust hanging in the air, ancient stone walls surrounding you, then suddenly seeing the remains of one of history's greatest rulers sitting silently before you after centuries underground. Even hardened medieval soldiers would have felt fear, and fear has a way of creating stories. Modern historians believe many details surrounding the tomb were exaggerated over time. The image of Charlemagne perfectly preserved on the throne may have been partially symbolic rather than literal. Medieval chroniclers often blended fact with dramatic storytelling. Still, the emotional impact remained powerful. Because the tomb represented something larger than death itself, it represented the lingering presence of authority. Even centuries after dying, Charlemagne continued influencing emperors psychologically. Rulers measured themselves against him constantly. His shadow stretched across European history long after his empire faded, and perhaps that is why the cursed story survived. The tomb symbolized the terrifying idea that some figures become too powerful to rest peacefully in memory. There is another disturbing layer to the mystery as well. Throughout medieval Europe, opening tombs was often associated with anxiety about divine punishment. The dead were not viewed casually. Burial carried sacred meaning. Disturbing remains could feel spiritually dangerous even without belief in curses, and medieval rulers lived surrounded by constant insecurity, assassination, war, disease, political betrayal. When disaster struck after opening a tomb, people naturally searched for supernatural explanations, especially in a world where coincidence rarely existed in the popular imagination. Everything meant something. A storm might signal God's anger, an illness could indicate sin, and a dead emperor's disturbed grave might bring judgment upon the living. As centuries passed, Charlemagne's legend only grew larger. Medieval literature transformed him into an almost mythical warrior king. Songs and stories portrayed him battling enemies of Christendom with divine strength. The real historical figure slowly disappeared beneath layers of legend, and somewhere inside that mythology, the cursed tomb emerged. Today, historians approach the stories cautiously. There is no evidence supernatural forces surrounded Charlemagne's remains. The supposed curse likely developed through coincidence, political propaganda, and medieval superstition. Yet the story still feels strangely unsettling, because humans continue reacting emotionally to graves and ancient remains even now. Modern archaeologists opening tombs sometimes describe overwhelming feelings of tension, not because they believe in curses necessarily, but because death itself carries psychological power, especially preserved death, especially royal death. The sight of ancient human remains forces people to confront time in an intimate way. Entire lives, ambitions, victories, and empires reduced to silence beneath stone. Perhaps that is why tomb mysteries remain so enduring across history. The dead cannot explain themselves, and so the living create stories instead. Stories about curses, warnings, restless spirits, punishment. In reality, the true mystery surrounding Charlemagne's tomb may be simpler and far more human. A powerful ruler died. Later generations became obsessed with him. Fear and imagination transformed history into legend. Yet even knowing that, the image remains difficult to forget. A silent emperor seated beneath a cathedral floor while centuries pass overhead. Wars begin and end. Kingdoms rise and collapse. Entire civilizations change. And beneath the stone, the dead king waits in darkness while legends grow around his bones. Today, tourists visit Aachen Cathedral peacefully. Sunlight filters through stained glass windows where medieval emperors once walked nervously through sacred halls. Most visitors never think about curses or ghost stories, but somewhere beneath the cathedral, history and legend still overlap. Because whether the curse was real or not, the fear surrounding it certainly was. And for the rulers who dared disturb the tomb of Charlemagne, that fear may have been punishment enough. The woman buried alive beneath medieval Europe. In the year 1355, workers digging near a church cemetery in medieval France uncovered a coffin unlike anything they expected. Inside lay the skeleton of a young woman. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then they noticed the scratches, deep marks carved into the inside of the coffin lid. The woman's fingers were broken, and her body was twisted in a position suggesting panic. Someone had buried her alive. For medieval people, discoveries like this were terrifying, not simply because of the horror involved, but because they forced society to confront one of humanity's oldest fears. What if death could be mistaken? What if people were being buried while still conscious? And in a world without modern medicine, that fear became one of the Middle Ages' darkest obsessions. Throughout medieval Europe, stories spread about coffins opened to reveal signs of desperate struggle. Corpses appeared turned over inside graves. Fingers were bloodied, nails broken. In some accounts, bodies had partially torn through burial cloths trying to escape. Some stories were exaggerated. Some were likely myths. But historians believe a horrifying truth existed beneath many of them. People really were sometimes buried alive. To understand how this could happen, we need to understand medieval medicine. The Middle Ages lacked reliable methods for determining death. There were no heart monitors, no brain scans, no modern emergency care. Doctors and priests relied mostly on visible signs: breathing, pulse, body temperature, and appearance. But certain illnesses could slow these signs dramatically, especially during epidemics. Diseases like plague, cholera, and severe fevers sometimes push victims into states resembling death itself. Weak breathing, unconsciousness, paralysis, and cold skin could easily confuse frightened families desperate to avoid infection. And during major outbreaks, burials often happened quickly, very quickly. In plague-ridden cities, bodies sometimes filled streets faster than officials could manage them. Fear overwhelmed caution. The living wanted the dead removed immediately, which meant mistakes became terrifyingly possible. Imagine medieval Europe during a plague outbreak. church bells tolling endlessly, carts carrying bodies through narrow streets, families terrified to touch sick relatives, priests rushing from house to house offering final prayers. Under such conditions, who would carefully verify whether every victim was truly dead? The possibility haunted people constantly. One famous medieval legend tells of a woman declared dead after severe illness, who supposedly awakened during her funeral service. Witnesses claimed sounds emerged from the coffin just before burial, causing mourners to panic. Whether the story was true hardly mattered. Stories like it spread everywhere, and fear began changing burial practices themselves. Some wealthy families delayed funerals intentionally, allowing more time to confirm death. Others watched bodies for days before burial. Bells were sometimes placed near coffins in later centuries so buried individuals could signal for help if they awakened underground. The fear became cultural, even spiritual, because medieval Christianity placed enormous importance on proper burial and peaceful death. The idea of waking inside a coffin beneath the earth represented almost unimaginable horror. Not just physical suffering, but spiritual isolation, darkness, silence, air slowly disappearing while tons of soil press down overhead. Few fears are more primal. And perhaps the most disturbing part is that the fear was not irrational. Modern historians and medical researchers acknowledge that premature burial likely happened throughout history more often than official records reveal. Catalepsy, coma-like illnesses, poisoning, neurological disorders, and extreme hypothermia can all mimic death under certain conditions. Without modern tools, mistakes were inevitable, especially in medieval Europe. Yet over time, the fear of premature burial evolved into something even darker. People began connecting it to the supernatural. Some believed victims buried alive returned as restless spirits. Others associated mysterious sounds from graves with demons or undead creatures. In Eastern Europe especially, fears surrounding improper burial helped shape vampire legends. This may sound surprising today, but many early vampire myths were not about elegant supernatural monsters. They were connected to real anxieties about death, decay, and disease. When graves were reopened, bodies sometimes appeared strangely preserved due to natural decomposition processes. Skin tightened, hair seemed longer, blood occasionally emerged from the mouth. To frighten medieval villagers lacking scientific understanding, corpses could appear disturbingly alive. And if stories of premature burial already existed, the psychological terror multiplied. Imagine living in a world where death itself felt uncertain, where someone declared dead might awaken underground, where graves occasionally produced unexplained sounds due to natural decomposition, where disease spread invisibly through villages, killing neighbors within days. The boundary between life and death became terrifyingly unstable. One especially disturbing account comes from medieval philosopher John Duns Scotus. According to later stories, Scotus may have entered a coma and been mistakenly buried. When his tomb was allegedly reopened later, witnesses claimed his hands were torn and bloody from attempting escape. Historians debate whether the story is true. But again, the legend survived because people believed such things could happen, and belief itself shaped medieval reality powerfully. There is another reason these stories spread so intensely. The Middle Ages were filled with uncertainty about the human body. People understood illness poorly. Mental conditions, sleep disorders, seizures, and paralysis often appeared mysterious or supernatural. Even ordinary medical emergencies could seem terrifyingly inexplicable. Without scientific certainty, imagination filled the gaps. And imagination tends to move toward fear, especially collective fear. Some historians believe stories of premature burial became exaggerated partly because they symbolized deeper anxieties surrounding mortality itself. Death during the medieval era was constant. Children died young. Women frequently died during childbirth. Disease could appear without warning. War and famine remained ever-present threats. People thought about death constantly because they had no choice. And perhaps nothing represented helplessness more completely than being trapped underground while still alive. Even today, the fear remains psychologically powerful. Modern surveys consistently rank premature burial among humanity's most terrifying imagined deaths. Claustrophobia, darkness, suffocation, and isolation combine into something deeply primal. Medieval people felt those fears intensely, but unlike modern people, they also lacked certainty that it could never happen. As centuries passed, stories surrounding buried alive victims grew increasingly dramatic. Gothic literature later embraced the theme completely. Writers described coffins opening in darkness, desperate scratching sounds beneath cemeteries, and terrified victims awakening underground. Yet behind the horror fiction remained a historical truth. Medicine was fragile. Human judgment was imperfect, and some people almost certainly suffered terrible deaths because others believed they were already gone. Today, archaeologists occasionally uncover skeletons positioned in ways suggesting panic or movement inside graves. Such discoveries remain controversial because decomposition and soil pressure can shift bodies naturally over time. But the possibility lingers, and perhaps it always will. Because premature burial represents more than physical fear. It represents the terrifying uncertainty surrounding death itself. How do we truly know when life ends? Modern medicine answers that question far more accurately than medieval society ever could. Yet even now, the exact boundary between life and death still carries mystery. For medieval people, that mystery was overwhelming. Candles flickered beside deathbeds, while priests whispered prayers. Families stood helplessly beside motionless bodies, hoping the soul had truly departed. And somewhere beneath medieval cemeteries, hidden beneath layers of history and legend, some graves may still hold evidence of humanity's oldest nightmare. The realization that the person inside the coffin was never truly dead at all. The massacre inside the medieval tower. In the autumn of 1483, 2 young boys vanished behind the stone walls of the most feared fortress in England. They were princes, royal blood, and they were next in line for the throne. At first, people believed they were simply being protected during a dangerous political crisis. The older boy, Edward V, was only 12 years old. His younger brother Richard was even younger. Both had recently lost their father, King Edward IV. And now, surrounded by powerful nobles and political enemies, the boys were taken to the Tower of London. They were never seen alive again. Soon rumours began spreading across medieval England. The princes had been murdered. Some whispered they were smothered in their beds. Others claimed assassins entered their chamber at night carrying pillows and daggers. But no official explanation ever came. And for more than 500 years, one disturbing question has haunted historians. Who killed the princes in the tower? To understand why this mystery became so terrifying, we first need to understand the Tower of London itself. During the Middle Ages, the tower was more than a castle. It was a prison, an execution site, a royal fortress. Its cold stone walls had witnessed torture, political betrayal, and countless imprisonments. Noble prisoners disappeared inside its chambers regularly during violent struggles for power, and medieval England during the late 1400s was filled with exactly that kind of violence. The country was trapped in a brutal conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, a long struggle between rival royal families fighting for control of the English throne. Loyalty changed constantly. Alliances collapsed overnight, and kings themselves sometimes died violently. In such a world, even children with royal blood became political threats. After King Edward IV died unexpectedly in 1483, his son Edward V should have become king immediately. But before the coronation could happen, the boy's uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, intervened. Richard claimed the children were illegitimate. Then he took the throne himself. He became King Richard III, and shortly afterward, the princes disappeared. At first, they were occasionally seen playing within the tower grounds. Witnesses reported glimpses of the boys looking through windows or walking the inner courtyards. Then suddenly, nothing. No more sightings. No public appearances. No explanation. Silence. Almost immediately, suspicion exploded across England because everyone understood the obvious reality. The boys represented a threat to Richard III's rule. As long as the princes remained alive, some nobles might attempt to restore them to the throne. Removing them permanently would eliminate that danger, and in the brutal politics of medieval monarchy, such actions were not unthinkable. Still, there was no proof, only rumours. Yet the rumours became darker with time. One account accused a knight named Sir James Tyrrell of carrying out the murders on Richard's orders. According to later stories, the princes were suffocated during the night and secretly buried beneath the tower itself. But the story appeared years later, after Richard III had already died in battle. which raises an uncomfortable question. Was the accusation true or political propaganda? Because Richard III himself soon became one of history's most controversial kings. After his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the new ruling dynasty, the Tudors, had every reason to portray him as a monster. Depicting Richard as a child murderer strengthened their own legitimacy enormously. And over time, the image became legendary, perhaps most famously through the plays of William Shakespeare, where Richard III was transformed into a twisted villain consumed by ambition and cruelty. But historians today remain deeply divided. Some believe Richard almost certainly ordered the murders. Others argue there is not enough evidence to know. And a few suggest someone else entirely may have killed the boys later. The uncertainty keeps the mystery alive, because unlike many medieval legends, this story involves real political power, real suspects, and real missing children. Then, in 1674, something disturbing happened. Workers renovating the Tower of London discovered a wooden box beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. The bones were eventually placed inside Westminster Abbey, where they remain today. Many believed a mystery had finally been solved. The princes had been found, but once again uncertainty returned. Centuries later, scientists examined the remains but could not conclusively identify them. The bones were incomplete and heavily damaged. Modern DNA testing might help answer the question, but permission for extensive testing remains controversial. So even now, historians still cannot say with certainty whether the remains truly belong to the missing princes. And perhaps that uncertainty is exactly why the story continues haunting people, because the emotional horror feels unresolved. Imagine the final days of the boys inside the tower. 2 children isolated within enormous stone walls, while political chaos unfolds around them. Unable to trust the adults surrounding them, hearing whispers in dark hallways, watching loyal servants disappear one by one, and somewhere beyond the walls of the fortress, powerful men deciding their fate. The story touches something deeply disturbing about power itself. Throughout medieval history, children of noble blood were rarely treated as ordinary children. They represented alliances, claims, and political leverage. Their lives could determine the future of kingdoms. And when power is involved, innocence often offers little protection. The Tower mystery survived for centuries because it symbolized a larger truth about medieval politics. Behind crowns and ceremonies existed fear, paranoia, violence hidden behind royal authority. Even kings were rarely safe, and children caught within dynastic struggles could vanish without justice ever arriving. There is another reason the story remains emotionally powerful. Unlike many medieval mysteries involving legends or supernatural claims, this one feels painfully human. No demons, no curses, only ambition. The possibility that 2 boys disappeared because adults around them wanted power more than mercy. That reality feels disturbingly modern. Historians continue debating every detail intensely. Did Richard III kill the princes? Did supporters act independently? Could the boys have died naturally? Could one of them have escaped? Over the centuries, several impostors even claimed to be surviving princes returning to reclaim the throne. Most famously, a man named Perkin Warbeck convinced many Europeans he was Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince. His claim eventually collapsed. But the fact people believed him reveals how uncertain the truth remained. No bodies officially identified, no confession universally accepted, no definitive evidence, only silence. And silence creates legends. Today, tourists walk through the Tower of London peacefully, listening to guides describe executions and royal intrigue beneath grey skies. Ravens move along ancient stone walls while visitors photograph the old fortress. Most never truly imagine the fear those walls once contained. But somewhere inside the tower's cold corridors, 2 children lightly spent their final days under guard while the future of England shifted around them. Whether murdered or not, they disappeared completely from history. And perhaps that is what makes the mystery so haunting after all these centuries. Not simply that 2 princes vanished, but that nobody was ever truly held accountable. The medieval world moved on. Kings rose, kings fell, wars continued. Yet the fate of the boys remained buried beneath rumour and politics. And somewhere within the shadows of the Tower of London, One of history's darkest unanswered questions still lingers quietly in the stone. What really happened to the princes who never came out alive? The medieval trial, where animals were put on trial. In the winter of 1457, a sow was dragged into a courtroom in medieval France wearing human clothing. Crowds packed tightly inside the chamber as judges prepared for the trial. The crime was horrifying. The animal had allegedly killed a child. But what happened next was even stranger. The pig was assigned legal representation. Witnesses were called. Evidence was discussed, and after a formal trial, the animal was sentenced to death by execution. To modern audiences, the story sounds absurd. Why would medieval courts place animals on trial as though they were human criminals? But throughout the Middle Ages, pigs, rats, horses, cows, and even insects were sometimes prosecuted in official legal proceedings across Europe. Some were imprisoned, some were publicly executed, and others were formally excommunicated by the church. At first glance, it feels almost impossible to believe, yet the records are real. And beneath the bizarre surface lies something deeply revealing and deeply disturbing about the medieval mind. To understand these strange trials, we first need to understand medieval life itself. Animals were everywhere. Unlike modern cities separated from livestock, medieval towns mixed humans and animals constantly. Pigs wandered through streets. Chickens moved freely between homes. Horses filled roads and marketplaces. And because sanitation was poor, dangerous encounters happened often, especially involving pigs. Medieval pigs were not the harmless farm animals many people imagine today. They roamed freely, searching for food and garbage, sometimes becoming aggressive. Children could easily be injured or killed by large animals in crowded urban areas. When such tragedies happened, communities demanded justice. And justice during the Middle Ages was not purely practical. It was deeply symbolic. Medieval Europe believed strongly in moral order. Crimes disrupted the balance of society and offended both human law and divine law. Punishment restored order publicly, even when the accused was an animal. One of the most famous cases occurred in Falaise, France. According to historical records, a sow attacked and killed an infant. Authorities arrested the animal and placed it on trial formally. Witnesses described the pig dressed in human clothing before execution, apparently to symbolize the seriousness of the crime. The sentence was brutal. The animal was mutilated publicly and hanged before a crowd. To modern people, the entire event feels irrational. But medieval citizens did not see it that way. To them, the trial demonstrated that law extended across all creation. Nothing existed outside moral accountability, not even animals. And yet the deeper historians investigate these trials, the stranger the stories become. Because not all accused animals were physically present in court. Some trials targeted entire populations of pests. Rats, locusts, weevils, insects destroying crops were sometimes summoned before ecclesiastical courts in order to leave certain regions. Priests formally addressed the creatures as though they understood legal commands. One famous medieval lawyer even defended rats accused of damaging barley crops. His argument was astonishingly detailed. He claimed the rats had failed to appear in court because travelling safely was impossible due to the danger posed by cats along the roads. It sounds almost comical now, yet the legal records show the argument was treated seriously, which raises a fascinating question. Did medieval people genuinely believe animals understood morality and law, or was something more symbolic happening? Modern historians usually interpret these trials as reflections of medieval worldview rather than literal belief in animal guilt. The proceedings reinforced social order publicly. They transformed chaos into something understandable through ritual and authority. Because when tragedy strikes, humans instinctively search for meaning, especially in societies shaped heavily by religion and symbolism. Imagine living in a medieval town where a child has been killed violently by an animal. Fear spreads quickly. Parents panic. Rumors spread through marketplaces. The trial becomes more than punishment. It becomes emotional reassurance. A public demonstration that authorities still control the world, even when the world feels dangerous. And danger was constant during the Middle Ages. Life expectancy was short, disease common, violence everywhere. Medieval society relied heavily on ritual because ritual created psychological stability. The animal trials reflected that need. But there may have been another reason these cases became so elaborate. Medieval Europeans often viewed animals differently than modern people do. The line between human and animal behavior felt morally significant. If an animal acted violently or unnaturally, some believed evil forces could be involved. Particularly dangerous animals sometimes became associated with demonic influence or divine punishment. In rare cases, trials even included accusations that animals acted under satanic influence. That sounds bizarre today, but in a world where invisible spiritual warfare was considered real, unexplained violence demanded explanation, and legal ritual helped transform fear into structure. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these trials is not their strangeness, but how human they feel. Because modern society still conducts symbolic acts after tragedy, public ceremonies, trials broadcast nationally, rituals of blame and punishment designed partly to reassure society emotionally. The medieval animal trials simply express those impulses differently. Through a worldview shaped by religion, symbolism, and fear, there is also an uncomfortable truth hidden beneath many of these stories. The Middle Ages were often chaotic and unpredictable. People lacked scientific understanding for many dangers surrounding them. Crop failures, disease outbreaks, and violent accidents appeared terrifyingly random. Randomness is psychologically difficult for human beings to accept, so societies create narratives. A pig kills a child, the animal becomes a criminal. Rats destroy crops. The rats become lawbreakers. By placing chaos on trial, medieval communities restored a sense of order, even temporarily. Some historians also note that these trials reflected genuine sophistication within medieval legal culture. The fact animals received defense lawyers and formal procedures demonstrates how seriously legal ritual was treated. In some cases, courts even acquitted animals. One donkey accused of inappropriate behavior was reportedly spared punishment after witnesses testified to its good character. The detail feels strangely touching and strangely unsettling, because it reveals a society attempting to apply moral systems universally, even when doing so now appears irrational. As centuries passed, animal trials slowly disappeared alongside changing scientific understanding and legal systems. The rise of modern rationalism transformed how people interpreted nature and responsibility. Animals became animals again, not moral offenders, yet the old records survive. Pages describing courtroom proceedings against pigs and rats in careful legal language. Documents signed officially beneath candlelight while medieval judges debated the crimes of livestock. And perhaps that is why the stories continue fascinating people today. Because they reveal how differently human beings can interpret reality depending on the world they inhabit. The medieval world was not foolish. It was symbolic, fearful, religious. A place where unseen meaning existed behind nearly every event. And within that worldview, animal trials made emotional sense, even if they no longer make logical sense to us. Still, one haunting thought remains. Centuries from now, future societies may look back on some modern customs with the same confusion we feel toward medieval courts. Because human beings are always shaped by the fears and beliefs of their own time. In the crowded courtrooms of medieval Europe, frightened communities watched pigs stand trial for murder, while judges pronounced sentences beneath flickering torchlight. And for the people gathered there, none of it seemed strange at all. The medieval prophecy that terrified kings in the year 1139, a strange book began circulating across Europe. At first it appeared harmless, a collection of cryptic Latin writings supposedly describing the future of the Catholic Church. But as copies spread between monasteries and royal courts, fear followed closely behind them. Because the prophecies seemed disturbingly accurate, they described future popes long before those popes existed. Some passages appeared to predict wars, disasters, and political collapse with terrifying precision. And one final prophecy carried a warning so dark that generations of rulers became obsessed with it. According to the text, the last pope would reign during the destruction of Rome itself. After that, the world would face judgment. For centuries, kings, priests, and scholars debated whether the mysterious predictions were genuine messages from God or one of history's most successful religious deceptions. This became known as the prophecy of the popes. And even today, some people believe the final prophecy may still be unfolding. To understand why medieval Europe took such predictions seriously, we first need to understand how people viewed the future during the Middle Ages. Modern societies often separate religion from politics and science. Medieval Europe did not. To medieval people, history itself was part of a divine plan. Every war, plague, eclipse, famine, or royal death could contain hidden spiritual meaning. The future was not considered random. It was believed to be guided by God. And because life during the Middle Ages felt so uncertain, prophecy became emotionally powerful. Disease could wipe out entire cities. Kings could die suddenly. Harvests could fail without warning. People desperately wanted signs explaining where history was heading, and prophecy seemed to offer exactly that. The mysterious text later attributed to Saint Malachi supposedly contained short symbolic descriptions for future popes stretching centuries ahead. Each pope was identified through strange phrases rather than names. The burning fire, the shepherd and sailor, the flower of flowers. At first glance, the phrases appeared meaningless. But after new popes were elected, believers often discovered eerie connections between the prophecies and real historical figures. One pope came from a family symbolized by flowers, another had connections to sailing cities. Again and again, the coincidences seemed unsettlingly convincing, and slowly fear spread. Because if the earlier prophecies were accurate, then perhaps the final ones would be too. The most disturbing prediction described a figure called Peter the Roman. According to the prophecy, he would lead the church during a period of immense suffering before the destruction of Rome and the final judgment of humanity. To medieval readers, the implications were terrifying, not simply because Rome might fall, but because the prophecy suggested history itself had an ending already written. Imagine living in medieval Europe surrounded by war, plague, and political instability, while reading a text claiming the collapse of civilization had already been foretold. The emotional impact would have been enormous, especially among rulers. Kings and nobles during the Middle Ages were deeply superstitious by modern standards. Astrologers advised courts regularly. Dreams, omens, and prophecies influenced political decisions constantly. A prediction of future disaster could shape real historical behavior, and that is exactly what happened. Over time, various leaders became fascinated or frightened by the prophecy. Some reportedly searched the text desperately for clues about their own era. Others dismissed it publicly while privately fearing its predictions. But historians eventually uncovered something suspicious. The prophecies describing popes before the late 1500s seemed remarkably accurate. The prophecies afterward became vague and difficult to match clearly. That detail changed everything, because many researchers now believe the prophecy was probably created during the late 16th century, not the 1100s. If true, that would mean someone wrote accurate predictions about past popes, pretending they were ancient prophecies, then continued the list into the future. In other words, a forgery. But the story does not end there. Even if the prophecy was fake, its psychological power remained very real. People continued interpreting new events through its predictions for centuries afterward. Each papal election triggered renewed speculation. Newspapers, scholars, and believers search constantly for symbolic connections, and that reveals something deeply human. Once people believe a prophecy exists, they begin seeing patterns everywhere. The human brain naturally searches for meaning inside uncertainty, especially during fear. One especially eerie example occurred in modern times, when some observers connected Pope Benedict XVI to parts of the prophecy through symbolic interpretations involving his family crest and background. Later, after Pope Francis became leader of the Catholic Church, speculation exploded again online because Francis was viewed by some as potentially fitting the final prophecy. The Vatican itself does not officially recognize the prophecy of the popes as genuine. Historians largely view it skeptically. Yet the fascination refuses to disappear. Why? Because prophecies are emotionally addictive. They transform chaotic history into narrative. Wars become signs, disasters become warnings, coincidences become evidence, and suddenly the terrifying randomness of life feels structured again, even if the structure itself predicts doom. The medieval world was especially vulnerable to prophetic thinking because ordinary life already felt unstable. Imagine surviving during periods of famine, plague, and invasion while believing history was moving toward divine judgment. Every catastrophe could feel like proof the end was approaching, and throughout the Middle Ages, many people genuinely expected the apocalypse within their lifetimes. Religious texts describing judgment and destruction were interpreted very literally. Comets frightened entire cities, solar eclipses caused panic, strange weather or disease outbreaks triggered fears of divine punishment. The prophecy of the popes emerged inside that atmosphere of anxiety, a world constantly searching for signs. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the prophecy is not whether it is true, but why humans continue believing such predictions at all. Across every century, people repeatedly become convinced they are living near the end of history. Political collapse, war, climate disaster, disease. Each generation interprets its fears through narratives predicting final catastrophe. The medieval prophecy survived because it attached itself to universal human anxiety, the fear that civilization itself may not last. And when institutions like kingdoms or churches appear unstable, prophetic thinking becomes even more powerful. Because people crave certainty during uncertainty, even terrifying certainty. Some historians argue the prophecy's vagueness explains its survival perfectly. The symbolic phrases are flexible enough that believers can reinterpret them repeatedly across generations. In psychology, this is sometimes called the Barnum effect, the tendency to find personal meaning in broad or ambiguous statements. Yet knowing that does not fully erase the emotional impact. Read enough of the prophecy during a moment of global fear, and the coincidences can still feel unsettling. That is the power of symbolic storytelling, and medieval Europe understood symbolic storytelling extremely well. For people during the Middle Ages, the world itself was filled with hidden signs waiting to be interpreted. Dreams mattered, visions mattered, strange events carried meaning. Nothing felt entirely accidental. The prophecy of the popes fit perfectly into that worldview, a hidden roadmap of history itself. Today, the original text still exists, studied by historians and debated endlessly online. Most scholars reject its authenticity completely, but fascination continues because the prophecy occupies a strange space between religion, psychology, and fear. It reminds us how desperately human beings want to know the future, even when the future sounds horrifying. And somewhere across centuries of war, plague, collapsing kingdoms, and frightened rulers, countless people stared at those cryptic lines searching for reassurance and instead finding dread. Because if history truly follows a script already written somewhere beyond human control, then perhaps every empire, every king, and every civilization is simply moving toward an ending that cannot be escaped. The bell that rang beneath the earth in the winter of 1499, villagers living near a remote monastery in northern Italy were awakened by the sound of church bells ringing beneath the ground. At first, people assumed the noise came from the monastery tower itself. But when they stepped outside into the freezing darkness, something felt wrong. The bells were not echoing from above. They were coming from underground. Witnesses described the sound as distant and hollow, as though buried deep beneath the earth itself. Some villagers followed the noise toward an old cemetery near the monastery walls. The bells continued ringing for several minutes, then suddenly silence. The next morning, monks investigating the cemetery made a disturbing discovery. Part of the frozen ground had collapsed inward overnight, and beneath the broken earth lay the entrance to a hidden crypt nobody knew existed. Inside the chamber, rows of ancient skeletons sat upright against the walls, wearing decayed religious robes. But according to local legends, one skeleton was different. Its hand still rested against a rusted rope connected to a small bell. For centuries afterward, people whispered terrifying theories about what had happened beneath the monastery. Had someone been trapped alive underground? Was the ringing caused by restless spirits, or had frightened villagers misunderstood a far more ordinary event during one freezing medieval night? Today, historians cannot fully separate truth from legend, but the mystery survived because it touched one of humanity's oldest fears, the fear of being forgotten beneath the earth. To understand why the story spread so widely, we first need to understand medieval burial practices. During the Middle Ages, death was everywhere. Churchyards filled quickly. Plague outbreaks overwhelmed cemeteries, and monasteries often buried generations of monks beneath stone crypts hidden underground. These burial chambers could remain sealed for centuries, especially after wars, disease, or structural collapse erased memory of their existence. Over time, entire underground spaces disappeared from history, and medieval Europe was already filled with anxiety surrounding graves and the dead. People feared improper burial deeply, not only because of physical death, but because Christians believed burial carried spiritual importance connected to resurrection and salvation. A disturbed grave felt terrifying, a forgotten grave felt worse. The idea of hearing bells beneath the earth therefore struck directly at medieval fears surrounding death and unfinished souls, especially because bells themselves carried enormous meaning during the Middle Ages. Church bells marked time, prayer, funerals, emergencies, and warnings. Their sound shaped daily life completely. To hear bells ringing where no living hand could reach them suggested something unnatural immediately, and perhaps that is exactly why the story survived, because even if the event had an ordinary explanation, the emotional impact felt supernatural. Imagine standing outside during a freezing medieval night, no street lights, no modern noise, only darkness surrounding distant monastery walls. Then suddenly hearing bells echo upward from beneath frozen ground. Most people would have been terrified, especially in a world already shaped by constant awareness of death. According to later accounts, some villagers refused to approach the cemetery afterward. Others claimed they heard faint ringing beneath the soil on later winter nights as well. Soon, rumors spread across nearby towns. Some believed trapped spirits were calling for release. Others claimed monks long ago had secretly buried plague victims alive beneath the monastery. And one especially disturbing legend suggested the crypt contained victims sealed underground intentionally during an outbreak centuries earlier. The stories grew darker with each retelling, but modern historians examining similar cases offer more rational possibilities. Underground crypts occasionally collapse naturally over time, especially during harsh winters when freezing and thawing weaken soil. If a hidden burial chamber existed beneath the cemetery, shifting earth may have exposed old objects or caused structural movement. A loose bell attached to burial equipment or monastery materials might briefly ring during collapse. Acoustics underground can also distort sound in strange ways. Wind moving through narrow spaces sometimes creates eerie tones resembling distant bells or voices. Combined with fear and darkness, ordinary sounds can quickly become extraordinary experiences. Yet even knowing that does not fully remove the unsettling nature of the story, because beneath the legend lies a real medieval reality many people rarely consider. Thousands of burial chambers across Europe were forgotten completely. Entire generations vanished beneath churches, monasteries, and cemeteries, without records surviving. Wars destroyed archives, fires erased names, plague overwhelmed communities so quickly that graves sometimes went unmarked. Human beings disappeared into the earth silently, and sometimes the living rediscovered them unexpectedly. Archaeologists today still uncover hidden crypts beneath European cities containing rows of skeletons untouched for centuries. Construction projects occasionally reveal forgotten cemeteries buried beneath streets where ordinary people now walk every day. The medieval dead remain everywhere beneath Europe. Most are anonymous, and perhaps that anonymity disturbed medieval people deeply, because memory mattered enormously during the Middle Ages. People feared being forgotten after death almost as much as death itself. Prayers for the dead, religious rituals, and marked graves helped preserve identity spiritually. A lost burial chamber suggested abandonment, silence, souls erased from memory. The bell beneath the earth legend captured those fears perfectly. A forgotten crypt hidden underground, ancient dead waiting in darkness, and a sound rising upward briefly, as though the buried themselves were demanding to be remembered. Whether anyone truly heard bells beneath the cemetery matters less than the emotional truth of the story. The dead do not disappear easily from human imagination, especially during the medieval period, when death remained physically close to everyday life. People died at home, not hospitals. Bodies were washed by family members. Funerals passed openly through villages. Children grew up surrounded by reminders of mortality constantly, and because life expectancy was short, almost everyone carried grief. Under such conditions, ghost stories and burial legends became ways of processing fear emotionally. Some historians believe many medieval supernatural stories emerged from communities trying to explain trauma, loss, or uncertainty collectively. Strange sounds in darkness became spirits. Forgotten crypts became warnings. and ordinary accidents slowly transformed into myth. Yet there may also be something universal hidden inside the legend. Modern people still feel uneasy around abandoned cemeteries and underground spaces. Darkness below the earth triggers ancient psychological fears linked to burial, confinement, and death. The medieval story survives because those fears survive too. Imagine descending into a hidden crypt lit only by candlelight, dust hanging in cold air, rows of skeletons leaning silently against stone walls, the realization that nobody living remembered their names anymore, then noticing a rusted bell rope resting beside one set of bones. Even now, centuries later, the image feels haunting, not because of supernatural horror, but because of loneliness. The fear that human lives can vanish completely into silence beneath history. As the years passed, the monastery itself eventually declined. Wars and political changes swept across Europe. New generations inherited the story without knowing whether any part of it had truly happened. But the legend endured. Travelers whispered about the cemetery where bells once rang underground. Monks warned younger brothers never to wander there alone at night. And somewhere between truth and imagination, the mystery became immortal. Today, historians cannot confirm every detail surrounding the bell beneath the earth. Perhaps the event was exaggerated, perhaps entirely symbolic, or perhaps frightened villagers genuinely heard something echoing upward from beneath frozen soil during one winter long ago. We may never know. But maybe the real mystery is not the bell itself. Maybe the real mystery is why human beings continue listening so carefully for voices from the past. Because beneath every ruined monastery, every forgotten grave, every hidden crypt beneath medieval Europe, lie countless lives almost completely erased by time. And sometimes, in silence and darkness, history itself can seem to whisper upward from below the earth, asking not to be forgotten,